I've never been one to believe in ghost stories or things that go bump in the night. Growing up in a small town, you hear all sorts of tales meant to scare kids, but I always thought they were just that, stories. But now, after what happened, I know some stories are real, and some things are better left unknown. It started about a year ago. I had just moved into my own place, a little apartment on the edge of town. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and after a long day of work, I loved coming home to the quiet. There was a certain peace to the solitude, especially when you're used to living in a busy household. At first, everything was normal. I'd go to work, come home, watch some TV, maybe read a book before bed. But then, I started to notice things. Little things, like the feeling that I was being watched. I'd brush it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. After all, I lived alone for the first time, and it was easy to let your mind play tricks on you. But the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it got worse. It was late one night, about a month after I moved in, when I first saw him. I was lying in bed, struggling to fall asleep. I'd been tossing and turning for hours, feeling restless and uneasy. That's when I heard it, a soft tap on my bedroom window. My heart skipped a beat. I told myself it was just a tree branch or maybe an animal, but when I looked over, I saw a figure standing just outside, staring in at me. He was tall and thin, with pale skin that seemed to glow in the moonlight. His hair was dark, almost black, and his eyes were the darkest shade of brown, so dark they were nearly black too. But what I remember most was his smile, a slow, crooked grin that sent a chill down my spine. I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, staring back at him, my heart pounding in my chest. We just looked at each other for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only a few seconds. Then, as quietly as he'd appeared, he turned and disappeared into the night. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept telling myself that I'd imagined it, that it was just a bad dream, but deep down, I knew it was real. The next morning, I checked outside my window, hoping to find some evidence of his presence, footprints, anything, but there was nothing. The ground was undisturbed, and there was no sign that anyone had been there. For the next few nights, I tried to convince myself that it was a one-time thing, that I'd never see him again. But he came back. Not every night, but often enough that I started to dread the setting sun. It was always the same. He'd appear at my window, watching me with those dark, unreadable eyes, and then he'd vanish before I could do anything about it. I stopped sleeping in my bedroom, moving to the living room couch instead. I figured if I wasn't in the bedroom, he couldn't watch me, but even then, I could feel his presence, lurking just outside, waiting. I started to notice changes in myself too. I was always tired, my appetite disappeared, and I began to feel like a shadow. Friends would comment on how pale and thin I was getting, but I couldn't tell them the truth. Who would believe me? I didn't even fully believe it myself. One night, after weeks of this torment, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I had to do something, anything, to make it stop. So, I went to the one person in town who might have answers, Mrs. Hawthorne. Mrs. Hawthorne was the town's resident witch, though she was really just an old woman who knew a lot about folklore and the supernatural. I'd always thought she was a bit strange, but now, I was desperate enough to seek her out. When I arrived at her little cottage on the outskirts of town, she seemed to know why I was there before I even said a word. She invited me in, offering me tea that I barely touched, and listened as I told her everything, the man at the window, the sleepless nights, the feeling of being watched. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she sighed and said, "You've been marked, child. He's chosen you." "Chosen me for what?" I asked, my voice shaking. She looked at me with sad, old eyes. He's a vampire. And he's been watching you, waiting for the right time. I wanted to laugh, to tell her she was crazy, but deep down, I knew she was right. It all made sense, the way I was feeling, the way he looked at me, like I was something he could own. Something he could take. Mrs. Hawthorne gave me a few things to protect myself: garlic, a silver cross, and some herbs that she said would keep him at bay. She told me to keep my windows and doors locked, to never invite him inside, no matter what. I did everything she said. I hung the garlic and the cross in every room, sprinkled the herbs around the windows and doors. For a few nights, it seemed to work. He didn't show up, and I started to hope that maybe it was over. But then, one night, I heard the tapping on the window again. This time, though, it was different. He wasn't alone. There were whispers, faint but insistent, as if they were carried on the wind. They spoke my name over and over, urging me to open the window, to let him in. I stayed in the living room, clutching the cross Mrs. Hawthorne had given me, trying to block out the sound. But it grew louder, more insistent, until it was all I could hear. The room seemed to close in around me, the air thick and heavy, like something was pressing down on me from all sides. Then, the whispering stopped. The silence was so sudden, so complete, that it made my ears ring. I thought he might be gone, that he'd given up. But when I looked toward the window, he was there, staring at me with those dark eyes, his hand pressed against the glass. His mouth moved, but I couldn't hear the words. I could only see the longing in his expression, the hunger. But there was something else too, something that almost looked like sadness. I don't know what came over me, but I stood up and walked toward the window. I told myself I wasn't going to open it, that I just wanted to look, to understand. But as I got closer, I felt this strange pull, like I was being drawn to him, like he was a magnet and I was a piece of metal. His eyes never left mine, and when I was just inches from the glass, I heard his voice, clear and strong, in my head. "Let me in," he whispered. "Please." It was the please that stopped me. It wasn't a demand, like I'd expected. It was a plea, soft and desperate. I hesitated. My hand hovered over the latch, torn between fear and something else. Curiosity, maybe. Or pity. But then I remembered Mrs. Hawthorne's warning, and I stepped back, clutching the cross to my chest. "No," I whispered, my voice shaking. "You can't come in. I won't let you." His expression changed then, his eyes narrowing, the sadness replaced by something darker. He pressed his hand harder against the glass, and for a moment, I thought it might shatter. But then he withdrew, his face calm again, though his eyes still held that strange mix of hunger and sorrow. "You'll regret this," he said softly, his voice echoing in my mind. "You'll wish you had let me in." And then he was gone, disappearing into the night as quietly as he had come. I didn't sleep at all that night, or the next. I kept expecting him to come back, to try again, but he didn't. Days turned into weeks, and though the feeling of being watched never completely left me, I started to believe that maybe it was over. Maybe he'd given up. But I knew, deep down, that he was still out there, somewhere in the darkness, waiting. Waiting for me to make a mistake, to let my guard down. And I knew that one day, he would try again. So I moved. I packed up everything I owned and left that town behind, hoping that distance would keep me safe. But even now, in this new place, far from the old apartment, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night with that same feeling, the feeling that I'm not alone, that someone is watching me from the shadows. And sometimes, just before I drift off to sleep, I think I hear a soft tap on the window, and a voice whispering my name. I tell myself it's just my imagination, that he's gone, that he can't find me here. But deep down, I know the truth. He's still out there. And he's waiting for me to let him in.